As we've seen to this point, it's absolutely critical that we situate Jesus in his own historical context. One of the major criteria that we've discussed, the criterion of contextual credibility, insists that for a tradition about Jesus to be plausible, it needs to make sense in the world of first century Palestinian Judaism. If we try to look at the words and deeds of Jesus outside of that context, we will, of course, be taking them out of context. And any time you take something out of context, you misunderstand it. That's true of every word and of every action that every one of us ever experiences. And so we need to establish the context of Jesus before determining which of the words and deeds attributed to him actually go back to him. We'll begin then by considering the social and political history of Palestine leading up to Jesus' own time. We're going to have a few minutes here in this lecture of names and dates, which some people love and other people loathe. But as I tell my undergraduate students, there are some data you simply have to know if you're going to do history. That seems like a fairly commonsensical observation to me. And so, some social and political history leading up to Jesus' time. The ancient history of Palestine, as that part of the world was called by the Romans, was long and complex. Here we need deal only with a minute fraction of it, the fraction that bore directly on the context of Jesus' adult life. In a nutshell, the political history of the land had involved some 800 years of periodic wars and virtually permanent foreign domination. The northern part of what we call Israel, what the Romans called Palestine, was in antiquity called itself Israel. The southern part was called Judah. The kingdom of Israel, the northern part of the land, was overthrown by the Assyrian Empire in the year 721 BC. About a century and a half later, in 587 to 586 BC, the southern kingdom of Judah was conquered by the Babylonians under the Babylonian general Nebuchadnezzar. This is an important name to remember, I tell my students, because Nebuchadnezzar's name, for some reason or other, typically shows up on Jeopardy. And so it's the sort of thing one should know and know how to spell. Nebuchadnezzar leveled Jerusalem, destroyed the temple, and took the leaders of the people Israel, Judah, into exile. Some 50 years after that, the Babylonian Empire was overrun by the Persians, who brought an end to the forced exile of the Jewish leaders and allowed them, the Judean leaders, to return home. The temple then was rebuilt, and the priest in charge of the temple, who was called the high priest, was given jurisdiction as a local ruler of the people. This, as it turns out, was a man from an ancient family that traced its line back hundreds of years to a priest who was named Zadok. That's a name that will show up later again in this lecture. Ultimately, of course, the Persian king was the final authority over the land and its people. But local affairs were run by the local aristocracy, which was located mainly in the temple, with the head of the aristocracy being the Jewish high priest. This state of affairs continued for nearly 2 centuries until the conquest of Alexander the Great, ruler of Macedonia. Alexander was a great military conqueror who overthrew the Persian Empire and conquered most of the lands around the eastern Mediterranean, including, in his context, lands as far east as modern-day India, and including Palestine and Egypt. Alexander brought Greek culture with him into the various regions that he conquered, building Greek cities and schools and gymnasia, which were centers of Greek culture, encouraging the acceptance of Greek culture and religion, and promoting the use of the Greek language. That's why when the Roman Empire came through a couple centuries later, virtually everybody who was an educated elite throughout the empire already spoke Greek, is because of the conquest of Alexander the Great, which is why ultimately the New Testament itself was written in Greek, because these are all people who were living in the areas that had been conquered by Alexander. When Alexander died, as still a young man, he was only 33 years old when he died in the year 323 BC, his generals divided up his realm among themselves. Palestine fell under the rule of Ptolemy, who was the general who was in charge of Egypt. During all this time, Alexander's conquest and following, the Jewish high priest remained the local ruler of the land of Judea. That did not change when the ruler of Syria wrested control of Palestine from the Ptolemies in 198 BC. Whatever antagonism was felt during this period of foreign rule, from the Assyrians to the Babylonians to the Persians to the Greeks to the Ptolemies of Egypt to the Syrians, was exacerbated seriously under some of the Syrian monarchs, especially under the Assyrian monarch who is called Antiochus IV, otherwise known as Antiochus Epiphanes. He called himself Antiochus Epiphanes, apparently. Epiphanes means one who is made manifest, an apparent allusion to his belief that he was some kind of divine being made manifest, who implemented policies that were designed to kind of further his own stature and his ability to wreak divine benefits here on earth. Antiochus decided to bring greater cultural unity to his Syrian empire by requiring his subjects to adopt aspects of Greek civilization. Some of the Jews living in Palestine welcomed these innovations. They didn't mind adopting Greek culture because many people thought that, in fact, it was superior to every other kind of culture. Other people living in Palestine, though, found that this process of Hellenization was completely offensive. The process is called Hellenization because the Greek word for Greece is Hellas. And so adopting Greek ways is Hellenization. Many Jews living in Palestine didn't want to be Hellenized, didn't want to accept Greek culture because they thought that that would force them to violate their own religious and cultural traditions. And so they protested. In response to their protests, Antiochus tightened the screws even further, making it illegal for Jews to circumcise their baby boys and to maintain their Jewish identity. He converted the Jewish temple into a pagan sanctuary, and he required Jews to sacrifice to the pagan gods. His idea is that he wanted everybody in his empire to share the same culture, same basic kind of religion, and the Jews were recalcitrant, and so he tried to force them. A revolt broke out as a result. A revolt that was started by a family of Jewish priests who are known to history as the Maccabeans. They're called the Maccabeans because one of their powerful leaders was a guy named Judas. His nickname was Maccabeus, which meant the hammerer. He was a tough guy, a guerrilla warrior, and so Judas the hammerer lent his name to the family, the Maccabeans. They're sometimes also called the Hasmoneans, which is a name based on the name of a distant ancestor of theirs. This is the so-called Maccabean revolt. It began in the year 167 BC as a small guerrilla skirmish. It ended with much of the country in armed rebellion against its Syrian overlords. In less than 25 years, the Maccabeans had successfully driven the Syrian army out of the land and assumed full and total control of its governance, creating the first sovereign state in the first sovereign Jewish state for over 4 centuries. And so they'd been under domination by these foreign powers, but under the Maccabean revolt, Jews themselves took over control of the land. The Maccabeans rededicated the temple. This is one of their first acts in 164 BC. It's the act that's still commemorated by the celebration of Hanukkah. And they appointed then a high priest as a supreme leader of the land. To the dismay of many Jews in Palestine, though, the high priest was not from the traditional and ancient line of Zadok, but instead he was from the common stock of priests of the Hasmonean family itself. In other words, many Jews thought that these Hasmoneans had gone too far and had usurped the authority that was theirs. These Hasmoneans ruled the land as an autonomous state for some 80 years. So you have a period of time in which you have a sovereign state in Israel ruled by Jews, no foreign powers. It lasted until 63 BC, when the Roman general Pompey came in conquest. When the Romans, under Pompey, had taken over the land, they allowed the high priest to remain in his office, using him as a kind of administrative liaison with the local Jewish leadership. But there was no doubt about who actually controlled the land. It was Rome. Eventually, in 40 BC, we're getting closer to the time of Jesus now, in 40 BC, Rome appointed a king, a client king, to rule the Jews of Palestine. This was Herod the Great. Herod became widely known, both for his ruthless exercise of power and for his magnificent building projects, which served not only to beautify the cities of his realm, but also to elevate the status of Judea and to employ massive numbers of workers. So there was very low unemployment when Herod was building all of these projects that he had, including, as we'll see in a later lecture, the Jewish temple, which was a magnificent and huge undertaking. Many Jews, though, didn't much appreciate the rule of Herod as the client king of Rome and castigated him as an opportunistic collaborator with the enemy, a traitorous half-Jew at best. The charge of Herod being a half-Jew was based in part on his lineage. His parents were from the neighboring country of Idumea and had been forced to convert to Judaism before Herod was born. So he was born to people who converted to Judaism. They weren't themselves born Jews, and so he was called by many Jews a half-Jew. Jesus, according to the Gospels of Matthew and Luke, was born during the reign of Herod the Great. In fact, at the very end of Herod the Great. During the days of Jesus' life and ministry after Herod's death, Galilee, which was the northern part of the land, was ruled by Herod's son Antipas, Herod Antipas, son of Herod the Great. And starting when Jesus was a boy, Judea, the southern region, was governed by Roman administrators who were known as prefects. These were governors who were from the Roman aristocracy who were appointed to rule over the province of Judea. And so during Jesus' life, you have two different administrations. The north ruled by a client king, and the south ruled by a Roman governor. Pontius Pilate was prefect during the whole of Jesus' public ministry and for some years after his death. Pilate's headquarters were in Caesarea, which was on the coast, but he came to the capital city of Jerusalem with his troops whenever the need arose. There's a common misperception among people who probably watch too many Jesus movies that during Jesus' lifetime there were Romans situated everywhere throughout Palestine, and everybody felt completely oppressed because anything they did was being watched by Roman soldiers. That's a complete myth. There weren't Roman soldiers stationed throughout Palestine during Jesus' lifetime. The Romans didn't station their troops in the provinces as a rule. They would situate the troops on the borders where there was danger of invasion. The only troops in Palestine were those that were kept by the governor. There'd just be a small group of soldiers who would be his own kind of private guard. I mean, somewhat larger than a guard, but much smaller than an army. Most Jews never saw a soldier in Palestine at all. They knew, though, the Romans were ruling the land because they had to pay their taxes to Rome, and there were other evidences of their presence. But the idea of having soldiers everywhere scattered throughout the land is, in fact, a complete myth. Okay, well, I've gotten through most of our names and dates. My point of this brief sketch is not to indicate what Jewish children learned in their 5th grade history classes. As a matter of fact, there's really no way for us to know whether a boy like Jesus would have ever even have heard of such important figures from the remote past as Alexander the Great or Ptolemy. And we have no way of knowing whether he even knew who these people were. But the historical events leading up to his time are significant for understanding his life because of their social and intellectual consequences, which affected the lives of all Palestinian Jews. Even those who didn't know their own history were affected by the results of the historical events that preceded their lives. For it was in response to the social, political, and religious crises of the Maccabean period in particular that the Jewish sects of Jesus' day were formed. For example, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Essenes. Moreover, it was the Roman occupation of Palestine, the Roman domination of Palestine, that led to numerous nonviolent and violent uprisings during Jesus' time, uprisings of Jews for whom any foreign domination of the Promised Land was both politically and religiously unacceptable. As we're going to see, not every Jew thought so, but many did, and it led to huge social, political, military problems. First, let me talk about the Jewish sects that arose during the time of the Hasmonean period. The Jewish historian Josephus, whom we've met previously and will meet still again, mentions 4 of these various groups, or Jewish sects. In one way or another, all of these groups play a significant role for our understanding of the life of the historical Jesus. There are a few points that we can make about all of these Jewish sects as a group. First, contrary to popular imagination, most Jews did not belong to any one of these groups or these sects. Josephus indicates that the largest sect, the Pharisees, claimed 6,000 members, and that the Essenes claimed 4,000. The Sadducees probably had far fewer members. But put these numbers in comparison with the overall population. The overall Jewish population in the world at that time was something like 3 or 4 million people. So we're talking about very tiny groups. Most people didn't belong to one or the other group. So we shouldn't think about these the way we would think of, say, political parties in America, where virtually everybody is a Republican, a Democrat, or some named other party. Instead, this would be more like civic groups where some people belong but most people don't, like the Elks Club or the Rotary Club or something like that. They're small groups. Even so, these small groups were powerful in their own ways, especially in the social and political scene in Palestine. All members of these groups, of all the groups, every member of every one of these groups, subscribed to the basic theological views that were characteristic of Jews just about everywhere. They all, for example, believed in one true God, who was thought to be the creator of all things, who was revealed in the Scriptures, the Hebrew Bible, who had chosen the people Israel to be his people and had promised to protect and defend them in exchange for their committed devotion to him through following his laws. All Jews agree to these things. These various groups, though, differed in significant ways, especially when it came to knowing what obedience to God's laws required and to knowing how to react, both to the rule of a foreign power and to the presence of a high priest from a line other than that of Zadok's. And so I'm going to go through what these 4 groups involved. First, the best known group to us today, and probably the least understood group, are the Pharisees, who, contrary to popular misperception, were not, in fact, professional hypocrites. The Pharisees were a highly committed group of Jews who believed in following God's law as revealed in the Torah. The word Torah is a Hebrew word for law. It's often used in reference to the law of Moses, found in the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible. And so the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible themselves are sometimes simply called the Torah. The Pharisees were committed to following God's law as far as possible. The problem is the law of Moses in the Hebrew Bible is sometimes ambiguous, not clear. It wasn't clear, for example, it was clear that Jews were supposed to do things such as keep the Sabbath day holy. This was normally taken to mean that one shouldn't engage in work on the Sabbath the way one did on other days. But it wasn't clear what work was, because the Torah never says this is work and this is not work. Pharisees who wanted to keep this law and every other law as God had commanded had to come up with rulings to indicate what one could or could not do on the Sabbath in order to keep God's commandment, to keep the Sabbath day holy. The kinds of rulings that Pharisees came up with came to be circulated and to be seen as a set of oral laws that were set over against the written law of Moses. The idea was that if you keep these oral laws of the Pharisees, you will almost certainly keep the written law of Moses. The oral laws eventually came to be written down by later rabbis, or Jewish teachers, about 200 years after Jesus, in the book that I've previously mentioned called the Mishnah, which forms the heart of the very large collection of Jewish lore and learning that's called the Talmud. It would be a mistake to see the Pharisees principally as hypocrites who were not concerned to keep true religion. Quite the opposite, most of them appear to have been sincere and highly devout. Their emphasis was on keeping the law of God in all its detail. As we'll see, though, Jesus had a different opinion about what really mattered to God. We're somewhat less informed about the second group, the Sadducees, because unfortunately none of the Sadducees have left us any writings at all. It does appear, though, from what others have said about the Sadducees, including Josephus and including what's said about them in the New Testament, that the Sadducees were made up of the upper-class aristocracy of the Jews. Many of them appear to have been priests in the Jewish temple. The Sadducees are known to have disputed with the Pharisees over the status of the Pharisaic oral laws. For the Sadducees, what really mattered was what God had written through Moses in the Torah, especially as it related to the worship of God in the temple. Again, contrary to popular opinion, it was not the Pharisees, but the Sadducees who were the real power players in first century Israel. It was the chief priests who came from their ranks. They were the ones who represented the local concerns of the Jews to the Roman governor. The Sadducees, not the Pharisees, are the power players. The overarching concerns of the Sadducees were centered on the sacrificial cult of the Jews in the temple in Jerusalem. They appear to have been open to Roman rule, so long as the Romans allowed them to perform the sacrifices that had been prescribed by God in the Torah. Again, as we'll see, Jesus had a different understanding of what really mattered to God than the sacrifices prescribed in Torah. Third group are the Essenes, a group of highly religious Jews who believed that the rest of the people of Israel, including the Sadducees and Pharisees, had fallen away from God and become impure. As it turns out, we probably know more about the Essenes than about any of the other groups, even though they're never explicitly mentioned in the New Testament. In addition to references in Josephus and several other ancient writers, we now have in our possession a collection of writings that appear to have been produced by the Essenes themselves, the famous Dead Sea Scrolls. As was the case with the Gnostic documents uncovered near Nag Hammadi, Egypt, the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls was completely serendipitous. In 1947, a shepherd boy searching for a lost goat in the barren wilderness near a place called Qumran by the northwest shore of the Dead Sea happened to toss a stone into a cave and heard it strike something. Going in, he discovered an earthenware jar that contained a number of old scrolls. The books were recovered by Bedouin shepherds News of the discovery reached antiquities dealers. Biblical scholars learned of the find, and a search was conducted, both to find more scrolls in the surrounding caves and to retrieve those that had already been found by the Bedouin, who had cut some of them up to sell them off one piece at a time. Some of the caves in the region yielded entire scrolls. Others contained thousands of tiny scraps that are virtually impossible to patch back together. Most of these scrolls are written in Hebrew. There are some in Aramaic and a few in Greek. Different kinds of literature are represented in these Dead Sea Scrolls. There are copies of virtually every book of the Jewish Bible except the book of Esther. There are commentaries on the biblical books. There are books of psalms and hymns. There are prophecies that indicate the future course of events. And there are rules for the members of the community of the Essenes to follow in their lives together. When we sift through all of these books, we're able to reconstruct in some detail the life and beliefs of the Essenes. The Essenes appear to have believed that the Jews of Jerusalem had gone astray. They started their own communities in order to keep the law of God more rigorously and to maintain their own purity, in expectation that the end of time was upon them. God was soon going to enter into history and overthrow the forces of evil, including the evil Jews, and bring in a good kingdom on earth. The sons of light would overcome the sons of darkness in a final battle. The sons of light, of course, were the Essenes. In the meantime, before this happened, the true people of God needed to be removed from the impurities of this world, including the impurities of the Jewish temple and the rest of the Jewish people. And so, these Essenes started their own monastic-like communities, with strict rules for admission and membership. It appears that when the Jewish War broke out, that I'm going to talk about later, in 66 A.D., the Essenes at Qumran hid their sacred writings before joining in the struggle. They may have thought this is the final battle. They joined in, expecting God to give them the victory. God did not, and they apparently were all destroyed. In short, the Essenes stressed their own ritual purity as the most important aspect of their relationship with God. Again, Jesus took another view. The fourth and final group of Jews mentioned by Josephus is a group that he calls very simply the fourth philosophy. This, in fact, is a term that comprises a number of groups of Jews who believed that God had given them the land of Israel and that it should be taken back by force from those who currently ruled it. This group, or rather these groups, believed in violent resistance to any foreign power in the land, especially the Romans. They eventually had their way. As I've just mentioned, in the year A.D. 66, just a generation after Jesus' death, a revolt broke out against the Romans, leading to a 3.5-year war that ended in the destruction of Jerusalem and the burning of the temple. The religious outlook of this fourth philosophy centered on the Jewish homeland as the place given by God to his people. These groups thought that they should be able to take back the homeland by force, raising up the sword. They should not be ruled by any foreign power. Again, as we're going to see, Jesus had a different point of view. And so we've got these four groups. Not that everybody belonged to these four groups, but these four groups were highly influential in the social and political life of Palestine, and Jesus had a different religious perspective than each of these groups, different from the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Essenes, and the fourth philosophy. And so we can set what Jesus was up to in context of these other ways of being Jewish in the first century. In conclusion, it's important to understand something about the political and social context of Jesus' life before examining which traditions about him can be accepted as historically accurate. Otherwise, we take the traditions about Jesus out of their context and we misconstrue their meaning.